Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the defendant, the jury, and all counsel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your patience this morning. Did any of you see or hear anything about this matter in the media since I last asked you that question? Anything whatsoever? Has anyone attempted to speak with you about this case? I see no responses. Has juror number 5 contacted any of you since she was excused? Please raise your hand. I see no responses. Mr. Martinez, you may continue with cross-examination.
Ma'am, when we left off on Thursday, we were talking about your approach to an assessment in this kind of case, and one of the things that you told me was that with regard to 558, that was not a roadmap, but it was a guide that you used in your evaluations, correct?
Yes.
Additionally, with regard to your evaluations, sometimes you do interviews, correct?
Correct.
And those are called the clinical aspect of the evaluation, correct?
Correct.
And in addition, in this case, you did 44 hours of interviews, correct?
Yes, I did.
And additionally, you look at other materials such as written documents, correct?
Yes.
And you review those, and then you make your assessment, right?
I do.
One of the things that we were talking about on Thursdays was that even though that is the process that we follow, there's no requirement, if you will, that in this process, that there actually be an interview with anybody, right?
I'm not sure.
Well, you're the one that put together this continuum, right?
Yes, but I'm not sure how you're
Yes or no,
applying it.
ma'am?
No, I don't understand your question,
Judge,
Mr. Martinez. I don't understand what you're asking.
With regard to 558, isn't it true that when we started your testimony in this case, we started talking about 558? Do you remember that?
I used that to define domestic violence. Yes,
yes
I
or
did.
no?
I defined domestic violence. Yes, I did.
Ma'am, I'm just asking you whether or not this sheet of paper, you see this sheet of paper, 558?
I do indeed.
Whether or not this was used as this sheet of paper was used as part of your presentation at the very beginning of direct examination when Ms. Wilmot was questioning you. Yes or no?
It was used, yes.
And when you finished your cross-examination or your direct examination on Thursday, isn't it also true that this document was used when you were talking about whether or not the defendant was abused, correct?
On Thursday?
Yes. Do you remember back to Thursday, ma'am?
I do remember Thursday.
Do you remember that Ms. Wilmot was asking you questions for most of the day?
Yes, I do.
And for a shorter portion, there was the cross-examination, right?
Yes, there was.
At the very end, do you remember that Ms. Wilmot was using this with regard to your opinion of abuse in this case? Do you remember that?
Yes, she was using it as part.
Yes, so the answer is yes, correct?
Yes, in part.
So you do use it with regard to your assessment in cases of where the issue is whether or not there's any abuse, correct?
I don't really use any specific thing. I use that as a guideline, and I don't use it to apply specifically to each case. I use it as a template in describing what domestic violence looks like, Mr. Martinez, and a range of domestic violence. That's how I use it. And I use it in training.
And you used it in this case, right?
I did not use it in regard to Ms. Arias. If that's what you're asking me, I'm not sure.
No. I asked you whether or not you used it in this case in the sense that you walked into this court. Do you remember taking an oath and sitting up there early on the first day of these proceedings?
Yes.
And during the early part of those proceedings, this exhibit, this continuum of aggression and abuse, was used, wasn't it?
It was used as an explanation.
Or no?
It was used as an explanation.
Judge, could you instruct the witness to answer, please?
She is attempting to answer the question.
Ms. LaViolette, can you answer yes or no?
It doesn't feel complete, Your Honor, to answer just yes or no.
All right, Mr. Martinez.
All right then, ma'am. Isn't it true that when you first testified, Exhibit 558, and Ms. Wilmot was asking you questions, it was placed underneath this machine here, and it was broadcast for everybody to see it in the courtroom? Yes or no?
That's true.
And at the very end, isn't it true that this guide, this template, whatever it is, isn't it true that that was used during the questioning by Ms. Wilmot at the end of your direct examination in this courtroom? Yes or no?
Yes, it was.
But you're saying you didn't use it for any purpose in this case, right? That's what you're saying now.
I'm not saying that, Mr. Martinez. I'm saying I don't use it as exclusively as a diagnostic tool at all. I use it in training and to look at interventions in particular, but it also gives a more complete, and this is why it was used here, a more complete definition of domestic violence and the range of behaviors, and also looking at aggression that happens in otherwise healthy families that don't have patterns of domestic violence.
Are you done?
Yes, I am.
Did you use it in this case, yes or no?
Objection is to vagueness. Which aspect of the case?
Sustained.
Did you use it in this case as part of your presentation to the jury?
Yes, I did.
Did you use it in this case as part of your assessment of the defendant?
Not in particular.
Well, then why were we even talking about this, Exhibit 558, if it doesn't even apply to this case then, ma'am?
It does apply to the case.
Well, let me do it this way. If you said you didn't use it with regard to your assessment of the defendant, then what do we even need to look at this if you didn't use it?
I use it to look at the range of domestic violence. So in that way, I looked at it. I'm not someone who just lumps a diagnosis. And as I was very clear about, this is a range, it's a continuum. So I use it in that way. It's a framework that I think about. It's something that I use to look at what's happening in a relationship. So in that way, yes, Mr. Martinez, I used it.
So nothing in this 558 applies in this case. Is that what you're saying?
No, you mischaracterized what I just said.
I'm asking you yes or no. Are you telling me, yes or no, that nothing in Exhibit 558 applies as part of your assessment in this case?
I think I just answered that question,
Is that
Mr.
yes or no?
Martinez. I said that there is a range of behavior, and I used that to look at this case.
So what is on this document then was used by you in this case as it applied to the defendant, correct?
To a certain degree.
So if we want to talk about the defendant's case and we want to talk about how it is that you reach your assessment, by necessity, we can refer to Exhibit 558, right?
In a limited way, sure.
So that's a yes, correct?
Objection is characterized as her answer.
Overruled.
Is that yes or no?
You can.
And in this case, you also went through a number of answers to the questions, and you talked about the first column, and you also talked to the column to the end, didn't you?
I talked about all the columns.
Yes. You
Yes.
talked about every one of them in this presentation when you testified, correct?
Yes, I did.
And ma'am, one of the things that we talked about that in the context of whether or not Snow White was a battered woman, right? That's how it started, right?
I think we spent a lot of time talking
Is that
about
yes or no?
that. Is yes, we spent a lot of time talking
Ma'am,
about that.
did I ask you if we spent a lot of time on it?
I'm just trying to give you a more
Ma'am,
effective answer.
Judge, would you please ask that?
Ms. LaViolette, listen carefully to the question and try to answer the question you are being asked.
Okay.
Did we discuss this in connection with whether or not Snow White was a battered woman? Do you remember that?
Yes.
And with regard to that, in fact, you spoke about that back in Los Angeles in 2010. That's what your CV shows us, right?
Yes.
And in fact, that was a keynote address back in 2010, right?
Yes.
And so if you being the keynote speaker there, you discussed issues involving whether or not this applied in connection with Snow White, right?
No, I did not.
So, but you did deliver this keynote speech back in 2010, right?
It had nothing to do with this particular
All right.
continuum.
It had nothing to do with this particular aspect, but it did have to do with whether or not Snow White was a battered woman, right?
I think I said that that was a catchy title,
Right.
and I used the catchy title.
Right, but it was in connection to that catchy title, right? The present, where you were the keynote speaker, right? Ma'am, actually, that's not true, is it?
What's not true?
Isn't it true that you did not deliver the keynote speech back in 2010 involving whether or not Snow White was a battered woman?
Well, you gave me
Yes
the...
or no? Yes or no?
No, I don't know. I don't have my CV with me, so I gave several keynote addresses, and if you are trying to trick me with a year,
Judge,
you can
she's
trick
being
me with a year.
non-responsive. This is the issue we discussed.
I mean,
all right.
if you will allow me to see...
Ms. LaViolette, hold on for a moment. Mr. Martinez asked another question.
Ma'am, I want you to take a look at an exhibit, which is part of your CV, okay?
All right.
Please take a look at it and see if this is not page 3 of 34 of your CD. This is Exhibit 596. You recognize it?
Yes,
And that is a true and accurate copy of that particular page, correct?
yes.
Right.
Well, it's, yeah, part of it's of that page.
If I may have it back.
So,
I move for the admission of Exhibit 596.
Any objection? Yes, Judge, we'd object unless the entire CD comes in.
Approach, please. 596 is admitted.
Exhibit 596, and let's take a look at it. And specifically, at the top, it does say keynote addresses, correct?
yes, it does.
At the bottom, it talks about Los Angeles, California, ICAN conference with Snow White, a battered woman, correct?
Correct.
Now, let me show you a copy of the syllabus of that particular conference. Please take a look at it. Specifically, take a look at page 3.
Yes,
It does reference this article, Was Snow White a Battered Woman, right?
yes,
And it was presented by ICANN, wasn't it?
yes, it was.
And it was presented in Los Angeles, right?
Correct.
And this is the syllabus that went with it, right?
That's
Or
not
the
a,
class schedule.
that's just a schedule. There's no syllabus
Okay,
there.
this was the schedule, okay. I move for the admission of Exhibit 597.
Yes.
Ma'am, isn't it true that Exhibit 597 shows that you were not the keynote speaker, right?
I was in Las Vegas.
I'm not asking about Las Vegas, I'm asking about Los Angeles, ma'am. Isn't it true that you were not the keynote speaker?
It was considered a keynote. There were considered keynote panels, and I was
Judge,
on
would you
one of
instruct the
those.
witness to answer, please?
She is answering.
Overruled. You may continue.
I was asked to do. There were keynote breakouts, and I was a keynote breakout speaker. And it wasn't the person who was the plenary, no, but it was considered a keynote breakout.
Ma'am, the keynote speaker actually was somebody by the name of Catherine S. Connell, correct?
Yes,
And you were just part of Studio 3, where people came by to listen to you in the breakout seminars, correct?
it was considered
Yes,
a
ma'am.
keynote breakout, Mr. Martinez. That's why it's listed in keynote.
In your exhibit number 596, does it say keynote breakout addresses?
No, it doesn't.
So this only talks about keynote addresses, right?
I guess I put keynote breakouts. I
Yeah.
didn't.
Ma'am, with regard to keynote, you're the one that put this exhibit together, yes or no?
Yes.
Your CV is something that you control what goes into it, right?
Keynote breakouts
Ma'am,
are listed
Judge,
with
she's not answering
keynotes.
again.
Overruled. Continue your response.
Keynote breakouts are listed with keynotes. Because they're listed in the program as keynote breakouts. So that's why I listed as a keynote. I'm not trying to misrepresent myself, Mr. Martinez, if that's what you're implying. That's not what I'm doing.
Then I move for the admission of Exhibit 597 based on the fact that she said keynote breakouts.
No.
All right, 597 is admitted.
Let's take a look at this. When looking at page number 2, well, let's do page number 1. It does talk about ICAN, correct?
Yes,
And if we take a look at it down here, it does say ICAN, correct?
correct.
Then this indicates on page 3 that from 9:30 to 11 there was a keynote speaker, right?
Right.
And the person who delivered that keynote address was somebody by the name of Catherine S. Connell, correct?
Correct.
Now, your name's not on there, correct?
Correct.
And then you said, well, I delivered the keynote speech in the plenary sections. That's what you said, right?
No, I didn't. I was the keynote in a breakout session, in a studio session, it was called.
All right. And if we then take a look at the breakout seminars, does it say keynote speaker in the breakout?
No.
It just says that you're the person that's presenting that in this studio number 3, correct?
That's the way it was. You're implying that I think that I'm lying about what I do, and I don't lie about what I do, Mr. Martinez.
Ma'am, I'm not implying. I'm indicating that you're misrepresenting what you indicated here in exhibit number 596.
I was told...
Ma'am, let me finish my question, please.
Sure.
I'm not implying anything. I'm indicating that you misrepresented the fact that you were the keynote speaker with regard to this, was Snow White a battered woman? Because 597 indicates otherwise, doesn't it? And 597 is this one. Yes or no?
The...
Objection, non-conflict.
Restate your question.
Is the portion of the CV that we're talking about, which is 596, is it accurate when it indicates that in Los Angeles, California, in 2010, you were the keynote speaker involving this, was Snow White a battered woman? Yes or no?
I was a keynote breakout, according to Deanne Tilton, who was the director of ICANN, Mr. Martinez.
I'm not asking about anybody else. I'm just asking whether or not you believe that this says that you were the keynote speaker at a breakout session.
A keynote. It doesn't say that. No, it does not say that on there.
Ma'am, and one of the things that you seemed to indicate was that you really don't need to use Exhibit 558 when you're reaching your assessment, right?
It's a frame of mind.
I understand it's a frame of mind. I'm not asking about that anymore. I'm asking about whether or not you told me previously that you really don't need to use what's in Exhibit 558 when reaching an assessment in a case such as this.
I think that you misrepresent what I say, Mr. Martinez. I think in a global term, because I have read other people's work and my work, and I think in those terms, but do I put down a piece of paper and assess that way? No, probably not, but it's up here after all these years.
Well, ma'am, what you're indicating is that you do use it, except that it's in your head. Is that what you're saying?
I use it in part.
And it's in your head. Is that what you said? That's what you just said right now, right?
Well, it's in my head and it's on a piece of paper.
And with regard to this particular piece of paper, when, or this continuum, or whatever it is, did you or did you not use it in making the assessment in this case?
Objection, asked and answered.
Overruled. Did I use it at all? Did I use it because of my head? Because of what's in my head?
Did you use it? That's my question.
I used my way of thinking, which includes that.
And so if we take a look at Exhibit 558, it would reflect what's in your head, is what you're telling us, correct?
It would reflect part of what's in my head.
And nowhere in, and you didn't write a report in this case, correct?
No,
You spent 44 hours, you reviewed a number of written documents, but you didn't put anything in writing, correct?
no, I did not.
And in your approach, nowhere are you required, for example, to talk to anybody in reaching an assessment, are you? You're not restricted in that fashion, are you?
I'm not sure. Required by whom?
By your approach. Your approach does not require you to talk to anybody or conduct any interviews in making an assessment as to whether or not there was any abuse, right?
I was limited in what I could look at.
I'm not asking you if you were limited, ma'am. I'm asking you whether or not this approach that we've been talking about, the one that you've told us in the courtroom over these days, isn't it true that that approach does not require you to talk to anybody or interview anybody before you reach your conclusion?
That's not how I work.
I'm not asking you if that's how you work. Well, you say that's not how you work, right? That's what you just said, right?
That's not how I generally work. I generally do interviews.
Well, with regard to, for example, Shatanya Lay, do you remember that you gave us an opinion about what you thought about Shatanya Lay and Mr. Alexander? Do you
Yes,
remember
I
saying
do.
that?
Yes.
You didn't talk to Shatanya Lay as part of your opinion about what was going on between her and Mr. Alexander, did you?
No, I read what they wrote.
Right. So what I'm saying is you're not required under your approach to talk to anybody before you give us an opinion, right?
Two things. Not necessarily my approach, and secondly, what I am given that I am able to review that I find credible.
I'm not asking about that. You're willing to come into court like you did last Thursday in the morning and part of the afternoon and give an opinion about a relationship involving people such as Mr. Alexander and Shatanya Lay without talking to Shatanya Lay and without talking to Travis Alexander, correct?
I looked at far more than that, Mr. Martinez.
I'm not asking you what you looked at. I'm asking you whether or not you rendered an opinion in this courtroom about Shatanya Lee and Travis Alexander's relationship without talking to either of them. That's all I'm asking.
I did not speak to either of them.
But you did give us an opinion, didn't you?
On,
Whatever you gave us an opinion. You did give us an opinion, didn't you?
I gave an opinion within a context, Mr. Martinez, and I think that's important.
Whether it's looking at context or not looking at context, what you did is you read something and then you said, this is what I believe. That's what you told us, right?
What I believed based on a context, Mr. Martinez.
Right. And that context did not involve talking to either of the parties to that conversation, right?
That's true.
And in fact, though, you were able to tell us review with regard to Shatanya.
I don't know if they were texts or IMs. I get them mixed up. But it was written material that involved conversation between Mr. Alexander and Shatanya Lay.
What date?
What date?
Yeah, yes.
There was a range of dates, but
Right.
if you would refresh, I've reviewed thousands of documents. So what can I say? The document that you're referring to?
No, you were the one that referred to this opinion on Thursday, weren't you, ma'am?
Judge, objection vague. What opinion?
Sustained.
Ma'am, you told us that Shatanya Lay was vulnerable. Didn't you tell us that on Thursday as it involved her relationship with Mr. Alexander? Do you remember telling us that?
Yes.
With regard to that opinion, in terms of their relationship, whatever the relationship may have been between her and Mr. Alexander, when was that she was vulnerable? Give me a date.
Mr. Martinez, there were a range of IMs. And if you're asking me to be a history major, I'm not a history major, but I read thousands of documents. And if you can refresh my recollection, I would be happy to tell you the dates.
But you, as you sit here now, you can't tell us a time period when Ms. Lay was vulnerable in her relationship with Mr. Alexander, correct?
Which part that she was vulnerable?
You're the one that said that she was vulnerable after reading either IMs or text messages, right?
I did.
And so, wouldn't it be important to know the time period when this was happening?
The time period that this was happening was in 2008. Those were the IMs or text messages I read were during the period of time between 2008 and toward the very end of Mr. Alexander's life. Those IMs stopped.
So you're positive that it was an IM message that we were talking about?
I told you I don't know a text from an IM. It was a written piece of paper that I looked at.
And in that written piece of paper...
Or pieces, I should say.
How many pieces of paper did you look at to form just this particular opinion involving Shatanya Lay?
Mr. Martinez, I look at context. I don't have to remember exactly how many pieces of paper to form an opinion. And
well,
I think...
Wouldn't it be important to know whether or not it's based on just one text message or it's based on a whole series, if you will, of documents involving these conversations? Wouldn't that be important for you to know?
It's based on more than one text message, I can tell you.
It's based on what?
It's based on more than one of... There were several sheets of paper. There were numerous sheets of paper that it was based on.
One of the things that you also testified to was that in these kinds of cases, 90% of the communication is nonverbal, correct?
I did not say that. I said that in communication, and this is when people are looking at each other and speaking to each other, that there's a saying that 90% of communication is nonverbal. This is in face-to-face communication. I don't think we have research about what it's like now when people are doing things over the internet and Gmailing and that sort of thing.
You did say that 90% of all communication in the clinical world is nonverbal, correct?
I answered that. I said in face-to-face communication, that is the understanding. I did not talk about it in regard to written communication.
Didn't you say it's important to me because there is a saying in the, I don't know if it's all of the world, but in the clinical world, that 90% of all communication is nonverbal. That's what you said, right?
I explained how I meant that, Mr. Martinez.
Ma'am, take a look at this exhibit. It's 595. Look at the top. You can read all of it and see whether or not those words came out of your mouth earlier in the proceedings.
I don't doubt that those words...
Ma'am, please take a look at it. Please do that for me.
Mr. Martinez, I think you said it was 595. It's 598.
598, I'm sorry.
Well, within this context, we're talking about Mr.
Ma'am,
Alexander...
Please read it and tell me when you're done, okay? Are you done?
I've read the entire paragraph.
Yes
and
or no? So that is a yes, correct?
I've just read that paragraph. Is that...
Just, if you want, read the paragraph or read the whole thing. And when you're done, let me know. All right, may I have it back, please?
Yes.
Isn't it true that in proceedings here in this courtroom, you said, it's important to me because there's a saying in the, I don't know if it's all over the world, but in the clinical world, that 90% of all communication is nonverbal. Did you say that?
That is out of context, Mr. Martinez.
Sir, ma'am, I'm not asking you about context. I'm asking you whether that's yes or no. Did you say it or not?
It's not a yes or no answer, Mr. Martinez. It's out of context, and it's not representing what I said.
Judge, I move for the admission of Exhibit 598. I understand that I'll have to take the other part out.
Exhibit 598 is admitted as redacted.
Ma'am, let's take a look at Exhibit 598. The question is asked, why is that important to you, Ms. LaViolette? You see that?
Yes.
And then the answer is, it's important to me because there's a saying in the, I don't know if it's all of the world, but in the clinical world, that 80% of all communication is nonverbal. Did you say that, yes or no?
Yes, I did.
And then there's a sentence that says, and that's one of the things that we're looking at is the communication apparently by Mr. Alexander, that although he says it's okay for her to date, and then it goes on, right?
Yes, and it is in the context of also personal face-to-face communication between Mr. Alexander and Ms. Arias.
I know that's what you want to tell us, but in terms of Exhibit 598, it does say, I don't know of all the world, but in the clinical world, 90% of all communication is nonverbal. That's what it says, right?
Yes.
And if we are applying that to the conversation involving Shatanya Lay and to Mr. Alexander that you told us about last Thursday, that would mean that you were 90% wrong because there was you weren't able to look at the nonverbal communication, were you?
That's quite an extrapolation, Mr. Martinez.
Is that yes or no?
That's no.
And in fact, it's important to look at what the people are doing, is what you're saying, the way their bodies are, when they're saying things, right?
That's true in a face-to-face. You can't do the same thing when you've got written communication. But if the written communication is consistent over time between numerous parties, it's consistent. I don't know what else to say, Mr. Martinez.
But in communications where there are people talking, for example, in text messages, you would agree that you can't see their faces, right? You don't know what their faces look like, correct?
No.
No, you can? Or no, you can't? You can or can't?
I can't see their faces, no.
And with regard to what the person may be doing at the time that they're sending this and how they're feeling, you wouldn't get the gist of that if you're just looking at the written word, correct?
You can get a lot from the written word.
What you're saying is that by just looking at a text message, ma'am, you can tell what an individual many years ago was feeling just by looking at a text message. This is what you're telling us, right?
What I'm telling you is that I'm looking in many, many text messages, many, many communications. That's what I had to go on. And when that is consistent, I feel like that is a pretty straightforward sort of situation.
Ultimately, what you're saying is that you are a human lie detector, right?
Gosh, I didn't think I was saying that, Mr. Martinez.
Well, you're telling us, for example, that just by looking at a communication with Shatanya Lee and Mr. Alexander, for example, you're saying they're telling each other the truth, right? You're assuming that they're telling each other the truth, right?
Based on many other communications. It's part of a context, Mr. Martinez. I've said that several times, and that's really what I mean, is I look at a context of behaviors. I don't look at an isolated situation. It's always about pattern when you're looking at this.
And when you say context of behaviors with regard to this as an example, Shatanya Lee and Mr. Alexander, what you're talking about is reading, right?
That I'm reading.
Yes.
Yes, I'm reading.
Right? You're not observing them any other place other than what is in the printed word, right?
Yes.
And what you're doing is perhaps in your office or wherever is you're looking at this and you're saying, I'm going to pass judgment on what is going on in this particular conversation without talking to anybody that's involved, right?
I think you're mischaracterizing me.
Well, did you talk to Shatanya Lee?
No, but excuse me, I looked at, once again, Mr. Martinez, it's context. It's not this one conversation. I think that's important for people to hear, that it's about patterns and it's about context. It's not about one conversation with one person.
The point, ma'am, is this. With regard to what you may interpret as being vulnerable, could be meant as a joke by Miss Lay, and you wouldn't know it because you're not privy to what was going on at exactly that time that it was going on and couldn't see the faces. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, she stopped communicating with him after he talked about joking about or whatever about suicide. Apparently, she took it in a certain way and stopped communicating with him and was upset by it. So, yes, part of what I'm looking at is her reaction and the fact that she stopped making communication and he continued.
She stopped communicating with him via text message, correct?
Correct.
You don't know if they called each other on the telephone, do you?
No, I don't.
You don't know what it was that they were saying on the telephone if they in fact called each other, right?
I know that he
Yes or
pressed.
no?
I know that he pressed for communication via text, and she did not communicate. That's what I know.
That's what you're saying, but you don't know whether or not she relented at some point and called him. You don't know that, right?
No, I don't, Mr. Martinez.
So you're just restricted by the written word as it applies to her, right?
Yes.
And with regard to Reagan, do you remember Reagan?
Yes, I do.
And her last name is Housley, right?
Yes, it is.
How many items did you review with regard to her? Or was it just one or two?
No, it was more than one or two. One of them was 18 pages long. There were a number that were long.
And one of the things that you told us with regard to Reagan was that she was also vulnerable, right?
Yes.
And that conversation took place on May 19th of 2008, right?
I would have to see the date. I don't know the date unless you show me the communication.
In terms of benchmarking it, you read it pretty closely, didn't you?
I did. I read thousands of things. And if you'd like to show me that and recollect the date, I'd be happy to look at it.
I'm not asking you whether or not you read thousands of things. Can we agree that you read thousands of pages?
Yes.
All right. Can we move on? And I'm asking you with regard to the date. Isn't it true that in this particular email or instant message, there's a reference, a time reference, isn't there?
Objection, foundation.
Approach.
Ma'am, I'm going to mark an exhibit, and it has a highlighted portion of it.
And I probably need to get my glasses.
Please, while I'm doing this. Take a look at Exhibit 599 and the highlighted portion as to the date and the time. Just the highlighted portion.
All right.
If I may have it back. Does that refresh your recollection as to the conversation involving Ms. Housley and Mr. Alexander where she was vulnerable?
No, it does not. There were numerous about that same time. There were numerous conversations. So without looking directly at it, I would not be able to say this particular conversation happened on the 19th of May. No, I would not.
Well, you indicated to us, at least when you talked about their relationship, was that in terms of Ms. Housley, one of the things that you told us about her was that she was vulnerable, right?
She was anorexic.
You used the term vulnerable, didn't
Yes, yes, I did.
you? And you also are now telling us what she said was that she was anorexic, right?
Objection, Judge, may we approach? Yes, may we approach?
So you're telling us that in this message that you reviewed, one of the things that Ms. Housley said was that she was anorexic, correct?
I'm not saying on the 19th that she was saying that because I don't know what's in that communication, Mr. Martinez.
With regard to Ms. Housley, you just told us that she said that she was anorexic, right?
That she had been anorexic.
Right. That's what you just told us, right?
Yes,
This is part of the information that you used in telling us that she was vulnerable, right?
yes,
Additionally, as part of that, you also indicated to us that there was some issue about photographs, where Mr. Alexander was asking for photographs, right?
yes.
He wasn't asking for nudes, was he?
He was asking for close to naked, I believe.
He was asking for what?
There was something about, he was asking for a bikini shot.
Right, he wasn't asking for nudes, was he? That was my question.
With one, he was asking close to naked, and I don't remember if that was Reagan Housley or not.
So you can't, as you sit here, when you say that he was asking for photographs, you can't tell us either way whether or not they were nudes or not, right?
They were definitely bikini.
So you're saying that they were bikini shots then?
Yes,
And that's based on what you read, right?
yes,
And with regard to that conversation, one of the things that came up was that the defendant was Mr. Alexander Stalker, right?
yes,
And with regard to that conversation, the events involving the stalking were discussed, yes or no?
yes. There were a couple
Yes
of
or
events.
no? Yes or no? They were
Yes.
discussed, weren't they?
Yes,
Previously, when you were asked by Ms. Wilmot about that, you said, I see no evidence whatsoever about stalking. Do you remember saying that?
I still don't.
I understand. So you still don't see that even though they are referenced in that message, right?
I don't see that based on Mr. Travis's behavior toward Miss Arias. Stalking is a different ballgame, and it's a pattern of behavior, and it's a pattern that usually creates fear in the person that's being stalked. And so I don't see that with Mr. Alexander as he continues to connect with Miss Arias.
Isn't it true that when you just said fear, isn't it true that Mr. Alexander was extremely fearful of the defendant based on what was said in that conversation?
I don't get that based on what I'm looking at. Once again, Mr. Martinez, you're asking me to look at something that's isolated as opposed to looking at the context of what we're talking about.
You had no problem telling us, for example, that Ms. Housley was anorexic, right?
Well, she said that.
Right. So you believed her, right?
I believed her because she talked about lots of body image
Right.
issues. Yeah.
Right. But you still believed what was being said. You never actually got a photograph of her, did you?
No, I did not.
You never saw any medical records involving her, right?
No, I did not.
You're basing it just on what was said in that message, right?
I'm not sure if it's just one message, but
But
it was
definitely-
based on the communication between
Right.
Mr.
And in terms of the
Alexander.
photographs in the bikini, when you said that Mr. Alexander wanted those photographs, his wanting is based on a statement that was made in those messages, right?
Correct.
And so you're believing what Mr. Alexander is saying with regard to his carnal desire.
Based on much information, Mr. Martinez, not based on one communication with one woman.
But you are believing it, aren't you?
I
Yes.
am believing it.
Right. So you're taking what's in this instant message and you're believing, picking and choosing what to believe and what not to believe, right?
No.
Well, in this instant message, isn't it true that without telling me what is said, isn't it true that Mr. Alexander talks and uses the word stalking as it applies to the defendant?
Yes.
Isn't it true that he talks about certain aspects of that stalking behavior, right?
Yes.
In fact, in that instant message, there's even an indication from both parties that they believe the defendant is listening in or seeing what's going on, right?
No, there's an inference by Mr. Alexander toward Ms. Housley that she is listening in.
And in fact, isn't a message typed in as part of this conversation that's directed towards the defendant?
Yes.
So it's with the indication, at least, that they believe that she's listening in or monitoring that conversation,
The
right?
judge mischaracterizes her testimony.
Overruled. You may answer.
Right?
I don't believe that. I believe, do you want to know what I believe, or do you want me
No,
to?
I'm asking about what is going on there. Whether or not you believe it or not, we'll get to in a minute. Isn't it true that there is a written communication during the time that the two are involved in this instant messaging conversation of a message directed towards the defendant? Yes or no? Without telling us what it is.
Mr. Alexander is saying that to Ms. Housley. That's correct.
But isn't Ms. Housley, as a result of what Mr. Alexander says, also type something to the defendant? Doesn't she do that also?
He asks her to. Yes.
Yes or no? She does type it though, right?
He asks her to, and she complies.
Take a look at it. It's Exhibit 600. Have you reviewed it?
Yes.
May I have it back?
Sure.
Are there any indications there of the flirtatious aspect of their relationship?
Yes.
So that's included in there in terms of the issue of vulnerability as well as the photographs. And you've chosen to believe those because that's what you presented to us last Thursday, right?
Based on context, Mr. Martinez.
Judge,
based
it's a
on-
yes or no question.
Next question.
We understand that it's context-based, but you have chosen to believe that in this conversation, you have chosen to believe that they are being flirtatious with each other, right?
They're talking about boobs and libido
Ma'am,
and sex.
Judge,
and-
she's just not responding.
Sustained. Listen
Ma'am.
carefully to the question.
Yes.
You've chosen to believe that. You've also chosen to believe that she's anorexic, right?
She states that.
And you've also chosen to believe this thing about the photographs. Well, when you say that she states that, you've chosen to believe it, right? You told us about it just now, right?
There's quite a discussion about it in the email.
So is it yes, you did believe it?
Yes, I did believe it.
And so you've
Recovering anorexia.
And you've also chosen to believe this issue involving the photographs, right? That he asked for a photograph, correct?
Yes.
Right? You now know that, right?
I didn't see
We'll
that
move
in this.
on. We'll
Okay.
move
Okay.
And yet, when we come to the issue of the stalking, you have chosen not to believe Mr. Alexander when he says that because of the defendant's stalking behavior, he is extremely afraid of her. You've chosen not to believe that.
Based on his behavior toward Miss Arias.
Sure, but you've chosen not to believe it even though he's written it down.
He's written that he is afraid, and he.
Judge, you indicated that she shouldn't say what's in there, but
Can you answer the question without referring to what is written on the page?
What is okay? Will you restate the question,
Sure.
Mr. Martinez?
You've chosen not to believe Mr. Alexander in this conversation, which may or may not be towards the middle or the end of May. You've chosen not to believe Mr. Alexander that he was extremely afraid of the defendant because of her stalking behavior.
That's not the only reason I chose to believe it.
But
Not, or to disbelieve it.
But you chose not to disbelieve him, right?
Objection, double negative. On the question.
And rephrase.
You chose not to believe him.
I guess you would say that I did choose
No.
not to believe it.
What I say doesn't matter. You chose not to believe him, correct?
Once again, because of other information, not simply because of this.
So the answer is yes. Is it?
Yes, with a qualifier.
Now, the other
Martinez, we're going to take the noon recess at this time. All right, ladies and gentlemen, please be back in the designated area at 1:25. Please remember the admonition. You are excused. Have a nice lunch. The record will show the jury has left the courtroom. Ms. LaViolette, you may step down. Counsel, anything else?
Yes, I believe we